All right, good evening. My name is John Kenyon, and I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa City UNESCO City of Literature. And on behalf of my organization and the Iowa City Public Library, I'd like to welcome you to the latest Lit Talks presentation. Lit Talks is a series of occasional events designed to bring the authors of books about politics and social engagement to the library to discuss the ideas in those books. Tonight, we are offering our first virtual event. Thank you for helping us to experiment with this new platform. We're excited to welcome author Jesse Wegman, who will discuss his new book, Let the People Pick President, The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College. Later, I will introduce Caroline Tolbert, a professor of political science at the University of Iowa, who will moderate the latter portion of our program. Wegman has been a member of the New York Times editorial board since 2013, writing editorials on the Supreme Court and legal affairs. In his book, Wegman makes a case for choosing presidents based on national popular vote. Given that 2 of the last 5 presidential elections have been won by the candidate who lost the popular vote, Wegman's book is a timely contribution to an ongoing discussion in our state and in our country about our electoral politics. Wegman will briefly introduce his book, and then we will shift into a Q&A format led by Professor Tolbert. If you're with us on Zoom and you have questions at any time, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and type them in. We will monitor these questions as they come in, and Professor Tolbert will synthesize similar queries and ask them in addition to her own questions as she leads the discussion. For those watching live on YouTube, you can leave a question in the comments, and we will try to get those to Professor Tolbert as well. So now we would like to welcome Jesse Wegman to Lit Talks. Jesse.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll just say at the outset, I know I wrote a 270-page book here, and I have a lot of stories to tell and a lot of arguments to make. But I'll say that I think I have the easy argument. I think defending the Electoral College is really the hard argument. And the reason I think I have the easy argument is because I think that a popular vote for the president really is the culmination of 2 centuries plus of democratization in America. That really the story of the American experiment has been one in which inclusion and egalitarianism and expansiveness of the franchise comes out of what was really an exclusionary and very narrow electoral process at the beginning. And you can see that through all of the changes that have happened, from the enfranchisement of Black people and women to the direct vote for senators to the enfranchisement of 18-year-olds. You see this at every step along the way. The country has had choices to make about who is included in its democracy. And at virtually every step of that path, they've chosen a broader and a bigger and a more inclusive democracy. So in my mind, and I think in the minds of many people over the centuries, this is really one of the most important things we can do to really fully vindicate, I think, the words of the Declaration of Independence, which is that we are all created equal. All our votes must be equal, and the person who wins the most votes should win the election. Those are some really basic tenets of a democratic society, or Republican society, if you will. However you want to describe the system we live under, that's how we run our elections, all of them except for the biggest one of all, the presidency. So, I know you could look at me and say he's an angry liberal who doesn't like what happened in 2016 or in 2000, but really I'm only the latest in a very long line of people who've been calling for this. There have been more than 700 attempts throughout American history to abolish or amend the Electoral College. And they've come from all ends of the political spectrum. And I think so many of those efforts have really been based on an understanding that the way the Electoral College functions is not the way the founders intended it to function, and is not the way that selecting a leader should function in a modern democracy. And not only that, not only the principles that are at stake, but the actual practical impact of the college today really has a corrosive effect on how our representative democracy works. And just very quickly, the way that happens is that we have a system that's called the statewide winner-take-all rule, where states, all but 2 states, award all of their electoral votes to the winner of their statewide vote, no matter how close that election is in the state. And what that ends up doing is creating what we call safe states and battleground states. And every 4 years, there's only a few battleground states, and those are the only states that matter in the election. And what that means is the candidates for both parties, Republicans and Democrats, focus all their attention on just those states. The rest of us in the rest of the country are effectively irrelevant. Our votes don't matter. So those two things, the principles of a modern democracy and the practical effects of how the Electoral College plays out today, I think are more than enough evidence for me that we need to enter the 21st century as well as the 18th century and adopt a national popular vote for president. I think I'm done. If you would like to begin, Caroline, I'd love to take your questions.
So talk to us a little bit about the National Popular Vote Plan. I might have to do saying my internet is unstable. I might have to turn it off and turn it back on, which I can do. But the National Popular Vote Plan created, well, I guess invented by a Stanford professor. How many states have adopted? And talk to us a little bit about and maybe we should define for the audience, is that exactly, okay, we'll just start with the National Popular Vote Plan. It's the path around the Electoral College that is the most widely understood.
Sure. So what you're describing is what's known as the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact. And what this is, it's actually doesn't go around the Electoral College. It uses the Electoral College exactly as it's designed in the Constitution. So as you rightly say, this compact, it's a contract among states, was designed about 15 years ago by a man named John Koza, who is a computer scientist in Northern California. And he came up with the idea that if states, he hit on what is really like the central feature of the Electoral College in the Constitution, which I don't think most people know, which is that states themselves decide how to award their electors. That's not something that's written in the Constitution. It's not something the federal government decides. The Electoral College is fundamentally a state-based operation. And right now, as I mentioned in my introduction, 48 of 50 states do it one way. They give all of their electors to the winner of their statewide vote. That's called the state winner-take-all rule. That's purely their choice. They can do it however they want. 2 other states, Maine and Nebraska, allocate their electors by congressional district. But John Koza, the man who designed this interstate compact, realized, wait a minute, if states can award their electors however they want, and states were to agree to award their electors not to the winner of their statewide vote, but to the winner of the national popular vote, and further on top of that, if the compact that they entered to agree to do this did not take effect until states representing a majority of electoral votes in the country joined it, you add all those things together and you get guaranteed the candidate who wins the most votes in the country becomes the president. So it might sound complicated at first. It's actually quite simple and elegant, because all it's really doing is saying states that join this compact, states that sign on to the contract, say, we're going to give our electors our electoral votes out in a slightly different way than we have before. 15 states have joined so far over the last 15 years, plus the District of Columbia. Together, they represent 196 electoral votes. You need 270 electoral votes to win the presidency. So it's 74 votes short of taking effect and becoming the way that we elect the president. Virginia has been right on the edge of passing this law, so that would be 209 electoral votes. Anyway, we're very close, more than 2/3 of the way to this being enacted and becoming law. And I think it's actually the most plausible way of getting to a popular vote right now. And for a lot of people, actually conservatives who support this compact, one of its primary features is that it does not abolish the Electoral College. I know my book subtitle is The Case for Abolishing the Electoral College, but the popular vote plan that you're talking about does not abolish the college. It uses the college as it's designed in the Constitution. I think it's a brilliant design. Eventually I would like to see a constitutional amendment that sort of, built it right into our fundamental charter. But right now, I think this is as good a way of getting to a national popular vote as any.
So to follow up on that, there was kind of a group of states that passed the National Popular Vote Plan, but then we kind of had a slowing period where we haven't seen as many states. What are the arguments for a state not wanting to adopt the compact? For example, Iowa. We're here in Iowa. We're a relatively small state. We're also a swing state. What would be why Iowa has not joined the compact?
That's a great question. Actually, there hasn't been a slowdown. There's been a speeding up. In the last 2 years, I believe six new states have joined the compact since the 2018 midterms. You know, what has happened, unfortunately, so far is that the only states that have joined the compact are Democratic-led states. And although several Republican-led states were on the cusp of adopting the compact back in 2016, then we had the election. Donald Trump wins the Electoral College while losing the popular vote, and everybody sort of saw the Electoral College again as a partisan institution, and everyone ran to their corners. It was a real setback for the compact's efforts. The reason Iowa doesn't adopt the National Popular Vote Compact right now, to the extent that Iowa is a swing state, and I would say it's not quite, I wouldn't put it in the battleground state category for 2020. I think it's pretty reliably going to go for Donald Trump, but you're right that Iowa has in recent years been a swing state. And what's interesting is that swing states are in fact the only states that benefit under the current system. So this year, I think the swing states are going to be Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Florida, and North Carolina. Those are generally understood to be the states where the outcome is not clear enough in advance that campaigning there for both parties actually could make the difference between getting all of those states' electoral votes or none of them, right? And that matters hugely because Donald Trump won the election. He became president based on 3 states' electoral votes, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016. There was a total of 77,000 votes, and those 3 states combined, more than 13 million voters cast ballots. And just those 77,000 ballots made the entire difference for the country, where 140 million people cast ballots. So I think swing states recognize that they have this unbelievable leverage in the election, and they've always recognized that. So I'm not saying it's a good thing that Iowa doesn't join the compacts, but it is understandable. But that's really it. It's not big states, it's not small states, it's not medium-sized states that are hurt by the college or benefit from it. It is the swing states that benefit, and those are the only ones.
And I think some of our work has actually shown that it's small population swing states that may be hurt the most because they're drawing undue attention under the current system. And if it went to a national popular vote, candidates would want to campaign in places where there's larger, a larger pool of votes and also the swing states. So, and I think you're raising a really important issue because, yeah.
Sorry, no, I was just going to respond to that. It's actually not the case, and my book sort of goes through this, that in a national popular vote, the candidates are just going to zero in on those big population areas to the exclusion of smaller states. It's just not. It's just not true. And the reason is that when you look at how candidates actually campaign in an election where all the votes matter equally and the person who gets the most votes wins, we have elections like that right now. Not a national election, but we have that at the gubernatorial level in every state. When a governor runs, those are the rules. In every battleground state, those are the rules for the presidential candidates. And what you see in those races is that candidates go everywhere. They don't just linger in the big cities and vacuum up all the votes there. That would be crazy. You ask any gubernatorial candidate and they say, no, of course I go all over the country, all over my state, because even if I know I'm not going to win a particular area, I would like to lose it by less. And that's because every single vote in that state matters. They want to pick up as many votes as they can. So I really think chapter 9, the last chapter of my book, is our interviews with campaign managers and field directors from both sides of the aisle for presidential campaigns of the last 20 or 30 years. And they all say the same thing. They say, of course we would go everywhere. Of course you would talk to everybody. That's how you run campaigns when every vote matters.
But that is the argument, that is the big myth that a lot of people who oppose the reform of the Electoral College would argue, which is that there are these incentives built into the system. And just like why Iowa doesn't want to not go first in the nomination process, the Iowa caucuses, they also want to make sure that the candidates would come here. So I think that's a really important part of what you're shedding that's new into this debate. I don't know if you want to even mention this, but I just read today about Biden preferring an online campaign. It's a very different thing. So I don't know if you want to even tread into the waters of 2020 presidential.
I'm not a political consultant, so I don't, I read David Axelrod and David Plough's op-ed in our newspaper a few days ago, sort of exhorting Joe Biden to take a different approach and to, get with the program digitally. I think that's a smart thing to be doing. I'm not sure he's making the choice to have an online campaign. I would say he's been forced into it. I think we're all forced into a digital and online life these days, except people who are obviously the frontline workers who are having to be out in the world. But, obviously presidential candidates, and especially two presidential candidates in their 70s, have to be especially careful. They would be coming into contact with thousands of people a day under normal circumstances. And, it's just, they can't risk that kind of exposure. So I'm not sure my views on what Joe Biden will or will not do are that valuable. I think he has to do it no matter what. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how these new styles of campaigning might sort of poke a hole in or pierce the bubble of our beliefs about how campaigning has to happen or happens better. I think we're going to learn a lot this year about things that we didn't think were possible.
I have a question here from Carrie Covington, who is a professor actually at the University of Iowa. He says, moving to the direct election can be thought of as consisting of two tasks. First, persuading people that moving towards a democratic one person, one vote principle is good. Second, persuading people that moving away from the founder's choice of the Electoral College is okay. That is, that there's no constitutional magic to the college. It's not enshrined in some cherished principles and should be seen as a practical accommodations to the conflict of the time. What can you say about why the founder's choice of the Electoral College does not warrant the deference of legitimacy that we give it?
I think that's a great question. Both parts of it are great, and I appreciate the focus on the founders, because I do think a lot of people have that misunderstanding that there was this deliberate, careful decision about how we were going to elect a president. That's actually not what happened at the Constitutional Convention. The founders argued over this question more than almost any other at the convention. They started at the beginning in late May. They were going still into early September. It took them 20 different days of debate, more than 30 votes on different ways of selecting the president. And for no surprise, right? They had never had a president before. They were literally designing a country, a new republic, from out of whole cloth. They had the Articles of Confederation. Those clearly weren't working, but there was no president in that system. Now they had a president, and they needed to figure out, how are we going to choose that person? So, there were a lot of different elements going into why they made the choice they did. One of them we can say was just the realities of the time. People didn't travel far from home. There was no, national communications network. There were no telephones or TV. People couldn't learn very much about politicians and candidates for office outside of their local communities. And so the founders understood this, and they chose the Electoral College. One of the reasons that they chose the Electoral College was because of that concern, this feeling that not that they weren't afraid of democracy so much as they didn't think that people would know enough about national candidates. They did let the people vote directly for the House of Representatives, for example. They considered that to be the most powerful branch of government, and they were fine with direct elections for the House. They chose not to have it for the president because one of the reasons was because the president was going to be a national candidate, and a lot of people wouldn't know enough about that person if he wasn't from their part of the country. Slavery is another element that plays in here. So, there's a fascinating debate in the middle of the convention where James Madison stands up and says, a popular vote for president would actually be the fittest way to select a president, and would be the most likely to select a candidate of distinguished character. However, we can't do it. And he says, and I'm paraphrasing here, he says, because the southern states won't allow it. And he says they won't allow it on account of the Negroes. That's his line. And what he means is when the southern states have 40%, 50% of their population are enslaved people who obviously don't have the right to vote, if you had a popular vote, those states, influence in the national election would drop dramatically. So an electoral college works for the slave states because they get to count their 3/5 of slaves toward their national representation. That was part of the deal of the Constitutional Convention, right? That's the great compromise. I'm sorry, that's the 3/5 clause, and then there's the Great Compromise, which creates the Senate. The slave states actually get a lot out of that, and they don't want to give that up when it comes to electing the president. So these are all contingent things that are happening during the founding that, first of all, those blew up fairly quickly in the next years and decades. But today, obviously, none of them are present. And so electing the president in a way that, was decided by a bunch of men in a room at the end of a long summer, just because they just wanted to get the hell out of there and go get that document ratified by the states, is not really a way to choose a leader in the 21st century.
So I have, and I was sitting here as you were speaking, thinking of James Madison, who was, and who was very afraid of majority tyranny and of direct elections. In fact, the idea of all of these states passing ballot measures to legalize marijuana and do all these other things, that would have been really not, there were lots of arguments. So Carrie Covington has a follow-up question here, which is linked to what I was saying. What are the philosophical defenses of the Electoral College? And how would you respond to them? I.e., why do we not want to show deference to the founders who were very, 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 very much Lockean, driven by Lockean liberalism, very much philosophers. They were philosophers. They were trying. So anyway, so again, what are the philosophical defenses?
I mean, sure. I guess the founders were philosophers and brilliant men, and they were also slaveholders. I mean, they did a lot of things that were right. They had a lot of, amazing foresight about human nature. And then they also held other human beings in bondage. Like, I just don't think that following the founders blindly as though they hold the ultimate truth is really the path forward for America. Even James Madison, you mentioned his fear of majority tyranny. I don't think that's entirely fair. I think Madison had very complicated ideas about how a large republic should be run. And in fact, Madison himself says later in his life that he was mistaken about many of his ideas earlier in his life, meaning when he was at the Constitutional Convention drafting the charter that we now still live under. He said about, he lived longer than any other founder. So he got to see these things play out in practice. And he was, in some things he got right, and some things he was pretty horrified that he'd gotten wrong. And one of the things he pointed out was he said later on, majority rule is the essence of Republican government, the essence of Republican government. This is a man that a lot of people think of today as, oh, he was scared of the people. I just don't think that's an entirely fair characterization of where Madison comes from. But I just want to go back to what the professor said a moment ago, which was, you're trying to do two things here when you try to convince people of a popular vote. And the first one you said was that one person, one vote is the way to go. Well, I'll say two things about that. One is, I don't think I have to convince anybody. The majority of Americans, as long as they've been polled, have favored a popular vote for president. It's the people who don't want a popular vote for president that have to defend themselves. The only reason they don't have to defend themselves is because, you know, they have the system that operates right now. But one person, one vote, you know, that comes out of a series of Supreme Court cases in the early 1960s, which completely revolutionized the way that legislative district maps are drawn, and really, in turn, revolutionized our democracy. It made it a more representative democracy. It made cities count for more. It made places where Black people and other minorities counted for more, and basically more accurately represented the country as it exists, not the country as the lines are drawn by people who are trying to maintain unequal power. So one person, one vote really very quickly became a sort of accepted truth about what this country stands for and what modern representative democracy is. So I'm not even sure I have to convince anybody to come. I think when you see people arguing about this, say, of course, one person, one vote. I don't think anybody says, not one person, one vote. Like, that's just not an argument anyone makes anymore. I think the wind is at our backs, the people who want to see political equality spread across the country in the one election for the office that covers the entire country.
Well, there's lots of things we could do with that, because obviously one person, one vote is still not actually happening in all states. That's why we have distortion in that through lots of laws, including voter ID laws, lack of absentee and mail voting laws, and lots of things. But automatic voter registration is an interesting trend. We could talk about that. But we have some more follow-ups. I'm going to ask one question. The distortion in the Electoral College appears to have been getting worse. This is because during the founding, the difference between the largest state and the smallest state was about 17 times. I think that was the difference between, was Virginia the largest? And
yeah, it was actually well, it was 13-1 by total population. It was 6-1 if you count only eligible voters.
Okay.
So, but yeah, it was dramatically smaller than it is today.
And today, the state of Wyoming has 500,000 people and California has 40 million. So
Right.
If it were by population, that's an 80-1 times difference. So that's making this distortion that occurs where the candidate who becomes president and wins the Electoral College could lose by millions of votes nationally become much more common. This is supposed to be something that never happens. So can you talk to us a little bit? This is a story of demography,
Right.
and it's a story about
Right.
some states
Right.
that have exploded in population and some that haven't, and rules that were set back in the, hundreds of years ago, and then just natural change.
You know, it's funny that you say that was never supposed to happen. I don't think the founders ever really thought about a situation like what we've now seen twice in the last 20 years and 5 times overall in American history, which is a president who wins the Electoral College while not winning the popular vote. I don't even think the founders really thought of a popular vote, obviously the way we think of it today, right? Today, when we have virtual total enfranchisement of adults, that's a very different country than what the founders lived in, where, a very tiny percentage of adults were allowed to vote. Obviously not women, which is 50% of the population, not Black people, not Native Americans, not poor whites, right? So all of those groups are excluded. So talking about, even, I think if you had said to the founders, well, what would you say if the candidate who won the Electoral College didn't win the popular vote? They'd say, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? So your expression of that idea, that's not supposed to happen, I think is really reflective of what our values are today, that we assume that the person who wins the most votes is supposed to become the president. This isn't a liberal thing or a conservative thing. This is a basic democratic value. I have on the inside flap of my book jacket a quote: "The Electoral College is a disaster for democracy." That's not me saying that, that's Donald Trump saying that. Donald Trump said that on election night 2012. Why did he say that on election night 2012? Because he thought that Mitt Romney was going to win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College to Barack Obama. All it took was the hint that that might happen. And he was furious, right? And then he was furious for a very understandable reason, which is we expect majority rule to carry the day. And when it doesn't, it's it's angering, it's upsetting to us. And so I really think, this fundamental ideal of electing the person who wins the most votes is really at the heart of why so many of us aren't happy with the system that we have. And if it were to flip and the Electoral College were to go the other way and the popular vote were to go the other way, you would see Republicans all of a sudden jumping on board. So I'm really convinced of that. And it's nearly happened in the recent past. And in a way, I'm sorry it didn't. If it had, I never probably would have written this book because we wouldn't have the Electoral College anymore.
But can it really happen in that opposite way? I think the states that are most heavily populated many of them tend to lean Democrat. It seems like the chances are that Democratic candidates will. So how likely is it that it could go the other way? Then that's a really good question.
Yeah. No, it's true. Right now, I think it's less likely that it goes, if there is a split election, that it goes in favor of the Democrat as opposed to the Republican. Though I will say this, you're right to point out our shifting demographics and that we are clustering increasingly in a smaller number of states, right? More Americans are living in a smaller number of states. That's true. The influence that has on the Electoral College is a bit mitigated, though. Where that has the most influence is in the Senate, right? There's no question that shift in where Americans live is very much influencing the shape of the Senate. I think the statistic that I've seen is that by 2040, 30% of Americans will control 70 Senate seats, or will live in states that control 70 Senate seats, and 70% of Americans will live in states that control 30 Senate seats. Now that's just an outrageous distortion of representative democracy. I know the Senate was never designed to represent people, right? It was there to create state equality. But as you point out, states were, less than 1/10 as discrepant in their population at the founding than they are today. So I don't think the founders were actually upset at just even that discrepancy, that 6-to-1 discrepancy, right? Now it's 70-to-1. So I think that the country's democracy can't continue to function in a way that actually represents all Americans when you have those kinds of discrepancies. But in the Electoral College, the real distorting effect is not that, it is the winner-take-all rule. And that's because when that winner-take-all rule kicks in, a small difference in votes can mean all of a state's electors go from one side to the other. The most extreme example of that, of course, was Florida in 2000. Florida has millions and millions of people vote. 537 votes decide the state. George W. Bush gets all 25 of Florida's electors. Al Gore gets none, even though they were essentially tied. And by some counts, Al Gore may have even been ahead. So that kind of distortion of the electorate, when it's translated into the Electoral College, is really what's at the heart of the Electoral College's.
But the Senate distortion is in the Electoral College because each state's Electoral College votes is their number of U.S. House members and their senators. So, for example, the estimates I last saw showed that one person from Wyoming, are they worth 17 times the vote of somebody from California? Or was
they're roughly 3.8 times as much. But you're right about that. Mathematically, it's true. But my book actually, I go into this at some length because I think it's an important distinction to make. It's true that people in smaller states have disproportionate power in the election of the president over people in bigger states for the reason you just said, right? Everybody has 2 senators, and those 2 senators translate into 2 electoral votes per state. Every state gets the same number of electoral votes as it has representation in Congress. So Wyoming gets 3 because it has 2 senators and 1 representative, while California gets 55 because it has 53 representatives and 2 senators. But when you actually do the math, as you say, that's like almost 4 times the power for a Wyoming voter over a California voter. The reason that actually doesn't play that big a role in the Electoral College is it's offset by 2 things. One is the states also get their electors for their House of Representatives, right? So for their members of the House of Representatives. So California is far bigger and far more of a pot for the candidates than Wyoming is. Would you rather get all of Wyoming's 3 electors or all of California's 55 electors? It matters a lot more that you get California's 55. The other thing is that winner-take-all rule. And that's really the distorting effect on the Electoral College.
I just think that, I guess what I'm pushing you on, and I have another question from Carrie Covington, is that the problems with the Electoral College go deeper than just the winner take all. It also goes to the actual structure of the chips, which are
yes, I absolutely agree with you. My only point is that I think a lot of people assume that Senate bias that all the small states get is the real unfairness of the college. It is an unfairness, but it is a very, very minor unfairness compared to the power of the winner-take-all rule and the distorting effect of the winner-take-all rule.
Do you think that doing proportional representation of Electoral College votes by congressional district would fix it?
No.
Which is what we do. Maine does it.
Yeah. You're using two terms that I would use. You're putting two terms together that I would use separately. You said proportional and then congressional districts. Those are actually two different ways of allocating electors. Which do you mean, proportional, or do you mean congressional district?
I mean by congressional districts, but if there were, the candidate who got the most votes would get the extra congressional if it wasn't. So think of like Wyoming. Well, no, Wyoming's a bad state, but think of a state that had like five congressional districts. The candidate with the most votes would get 3 and the other candidate would get 2.
Okay, so you're describing two different systems, and let me, just for the people who are watching, let me explain how those two systems are different. So as we said earlier, a state can allocate its electors, award its electors to the candidates however it chooses. There's a method that 2 states use right now, you're right, Maine and Nebraska, which is by congressional district. And the way they do it is instead of counting all of the state's votes, they count the votes in each congressional district. And because a state gets 1 elector for every congressional district, they give the elector of each congressional district to whichever candidate won that congressional district. Then remember, states also have their 2 electors for senators. Those electors are still given out in those states on a winner-take-all basis. So whoever wins, so let's take Maine in 2016. Maine has 4 electoral votes. It has 2 congressional districts and then 2 senators. So in Maine, Hillary Clinton won 1 of Maine's congressional districts. Donald Trump won the other of Maine's congressional districts. They each got 1 electoral vote for that, but then Hillary Clinton won the most votes statewide, so she got the extra 2 electoral votes for the state senators. So she got 3, Donald Trump got 1. If Maine were a winner-take-all state, she would have gotten all 4, and Donald Trump would have gotten 0. So in Maine, the difference was only a single electoral vote, but you're right, if you were to apply that rule all across the country, you would start to see a variation in how the Electoral College vote turned out. I do not support that. I don't think it's a smart way of choosing the president for several reasons. A big one is partisan gerrymandering, which is, as we know now, many states use to punish the minority state in that state. In Republican-led states, in North Carolina, the Republicans have drawn maps that are dramatically unfair to Democrats. They did it in Wisconsin too. Maryland Democrats did it to Republicans. Everybody does it, and the Supreme Court has basically washed its hands of the matter and said, you guys deal with it, we can't step in and fix this, even though it's a massive distortion of representative democracy, partisan gerrymandering. Right now, partisan gerrymandering has no impact on the Electoral College, except in Maine and Nebraska. If you were to use congressional districts to award electors, partisan gerrymandering would be a central part of the way we elected our president. Now the other, do you want me to just explain what the other system is that you talked about, which was proportional?
Yeah, no, those are 2 different.
Right, so proportional awarding of electors is slightly different. That says if a candidate wins 55% of the votes, the popular votes in a state, he or she gets 55% of that state's electors. Sounds great. I like it. There's there's problems with that too. First of all, in most states, you can't divide their electoral votes so cleanly. So especially in a smaller state, it doesn't necessarily track to say, let's say a state like Wyoming, because we've been talking about Wyoming, has 3 electoral votes, and yet the state has a 52 to 48 popular vote margin. Well, how do you represent that with 3 electoral votes? You can't do it. And once you start spreading that distortion across the country, you end up with many of the same problems that we're dealing with today, which is an outcome in the Electoral College that does not reflect the popular vote in the country. There are other problems with the proportional awarding of electors, but I can go into them later if people are interested, but that's one of the big ones.
And Carrie, I'll just add in, Carrie says in 2008, Nebraska gave all but one vote to McCain. Obama got the district for Omaha.
That's right. Yep.
And Carrie also says in 2016, if you take away the 100 Senate votes, so now the Electoral College is down to the 435. Trump would have still won. It was the winner take all that made a difference. And I do think that these different pieces of distortion and just the awareness of how much distortion in the political system, and we haven't even talked about who can and cannot vote and the systematic biases in voter turnout in this country across states, across demographic groups.
Yep.
But I do want to just make sure I get in Carrie's last question here. If the founders had to make this elaborate structure to accommodate the intractable conflicts that molded the creation of the Electoral College, and this was the small states versus the large states, and the slave states versus the non-slave, and the Federalists versus the anti-Federalists, what are the practical prospects of getting people today to look past their immediate political interests to do what is best, which is have a system where the majority actually do get to pick the president, or the winner of a football game that has the most points on the board actually wins? Can imagine the Super Bowl if the team that lost was the winner. The founders couldn't do it. Why should we expect today's politicians to do any better?
I mean, I think, again, it's a great question, and it does point up one of the biggest obstacles to reform of the Electoral College over our history, which is that people support it not out of any great commitment to principle, but out of a belief that it helps their side. One of the most interesting stories that I tell in the book, and this is in chapter 5, is about the closest that we ever came to abolishing the Electoral College through a constitutional amendment. This happened in the late 1960s, it was 50 years ago, and it was led by Senator Birch Bayh of Indiana, who took basically 4 years to build up public support for a popular vote. He did an amazing job of it. By the end of the 1960s, more than 80% of Americans supported a popular vote for president. This included Republicans and Democrats all over the country. It included President Richard Nixon. It included George H.W. Bush. It included Bob Dole, Gerald Ford, top Republican leaders of the time. This was not a partisan issue at that time. Why did it fail? It actually passed the House of Representatives. This is an amendment to abolish the Electoral College, passed the House of Representatives in 1969, 339 to 70. That's overwhelmingly passing. It easily clears the 2/3 requirement of the Constitution for an amendment. It looked as though they might have enough states to ratify an amendment. Once it got to them, it had to just get through the Senate first. Why didn't it get through the Senate? It failed in the Senate because of a filibuster that was led by 3 Southern segregationist senators, Strom Thurmond, Sam Ervin, and Jim Eastland. And they knew how the Electoral College worked. They understood that winner take all gave, white conservatives in the South a basic, monopoly control over their electoral votes because, black voters in the South just didn't have any voice. And if you had suddenly a popular vote election, those black voters would suddenly count. And right now they don't. They're still today, they don't. Throughout the South, millions of black voters' votes are essentially erased by the Electoral College because all of those Southern states go for Republicans. Blacks in the South are overwhelmingly favored Democrats since the late 19th, since the Civil Rights era. So I think it's important to remember that the people who thought that the people who killed off that amendment push in the late 1960s were people who believed that the Electoral College helped them, it gave them a benefit. But the interesting part of that story is it wasn't just the Southern segregationists. They were helped by black politicians in the North, because in the North were the swing states, the big swing states of the middle of the 20th century, like New York, like Illinois. And the people who made those states swing were ethnic and racial minorities in the big cities. So black voters understood this, and black politicians understood this. They understood that the Electoral College gave them a disproportionate leverage in the choice of the president. And they didn't want to give that up because who wants to give up power? Nobody wants to give up power voluntarily. So you had this weird alliance between black politicians in the North and Southern segregationists in this, in South Carolina and North Carolina and Mississippi. And that's what killed off the Electoral College reform of that era. So that brings us to the question, how do you ever hope to change a system when there are entrenched interests that think that that system benefits them? And the answer that I have to that is, it benefits them until it doesn't, right? So Texas, is definitely moving toward becoming a purple state and possibly even a blue state in the next decade or so. Georgia could get there faster. Arizona could get there this year. If Republicans lose Texas, right? If Texas stops being a so-called red state and becomes a blue state, Republicans have no clear path to the White House. And all of a sudden, the Electoral College is going to look really unpleasant to them. And so I really think that to the extent that you can make people understand that just to look a little bit beyond their immediate, what appears to them to be their immediate political advantage and see the bigger picture, I think we really actually can enact a lot of reforms here. The Popular Vote Compact is doing this. It's been doing it for 15 years. It's 2/3 of the way there. It does need some red states to sign on, but I actually think it can get there as people start to understand just how tenuous the existing situation is.
Okay, you've done great. This has been a great discussion. We are going to start thinking about one or two final questions. I have a question. Which state, Utah, which just adopted ranked choice voting for local elections, is a red state? Which states would you look to that are red states to be leaders in this movement? I think it's really important.
Yeah, it's a great question. Utah and Georgia and Arizona were all very close to passing this interstate compact back in 2016. And as I mentioned earlier, the election happened and everybody sort of scrambled away from the center and freaked out. And so that fell off the map. You won't find any mainstream Republican politicians today who will publicly come out in support. But Republicans have been behind this compact and behind this effort for years. That it's run by a team of both Democrats and Republicans together, and they go to state lawmakers and they talk to them about their efforts. And they say, whenever we can sit in a room with somebody for a few hours and answer their questions and clear up the misconceptions about the Electoral College and about the popular vote, we win them over. And what has to happen now is that those states have to go from a few Republican lawmakers being won over to actually passing it and getting the governor to sign it. And that is going to be a heavier lift. But I do think Georgia and Arizona and Utah are good candidates. And that's partly because states that are red but trending purple, those lawmakers who are in power now realize, oh, we may be about to be out of power very soon. And when that happens, we don't want to be completely erased the way the Democrats are right now. We don't want to lose all power. Let's say Georgia becomes a blue state, right? And I hate this term red and blue just because all states are purple, right? Millions of Republicans and Democrats live in every state. But in Georgia, if the Republicans realize, oh, in a few years, when our state, becomes when Democrats take over the state house and Democrats take over the governorship, then it will be we'll start to give all of our electoral votes to the Democrat. They realize it's in their political interest to switch to a popular vote where their votes actually count again and count equal to all voters everywhere in the country.
So I'm a real fan of the way you get major change in a system is some sort of shock or threat or like an earthquake that kind of rebalances the system. We saw this with the Great Depression and then the New Deal coalition and what it was able to do. We saw this coming out of different wars. Well, we saw this coming out of the Revolutionary War, which created this this Constitution. Now we'll just call this the last question. We are definitely in this COVID 2020 crisis, except who we're at war with is this little non-living micro non-living thing. How do you think that we can get, how do you think we can get the public aligned and do the important and hard work of basically updating our electoral systems and our institutions to make governance work again. I mean, we're really long overdue in putting the attention to fixing the system. And I just wonder how this fits in with a lot of stuff and how COVID could affect it or not.
It's a great point. We are in a moment we're in a profound national trauma right now. We don't even know the full scope of it. We haven't seen anything like this in our lifetimes. Obviously 9/11 was the last thing that even came close. And that was a single day that reverberated for years, of course, but it only happened in a single day. Now we're sort of seeing a 9/11 virtually every single day in terms of number of Americans dying. It's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And I do think these are moments where we kind of rethink some assumptions that we had about how things work. Rules that suddenly go out the window make us think, wait, why did we have those rules in the first place? Are they good rules? And I think the Electoral College, the way we choose the president, the way we run our elections generally, is a prime candidate for reform in that regard. I think a lot of people are asking that question. Hold on. Why do we have to come to the polls to vote? Why do we choose the president by by this bizarre, antiquated system of 538 electors? All sorts of things that I think nobody even questioned or thought was possible to change even just a few months ago suddenly now seem up for grabs. And I actually think that's a great thing. I mean, it's one silver lining of all of the trauma of these last few months and the unbelievable loss of life and loss of people's livelihoods and economy is that there is an opportunity to rethink how we run our democracy in ways that are better for everyone. I do think that the popular vote should be at the center of that conversation. I really do hope that one of the things that comes out of this is a renewed willingness to think about our democracy and think about the American Republic in fresh ways, and to say, you know what, there's a lot of things that weren't working and they didn't have to be that way. Let's try this.
And not very many politicians seem to want to talk about election reform as a major theme. Tom Steyer had term limits and campaign finance as one of two of his issues, but he was rare among the candidates.
I mean, I don't think that's entirely fair. I mean, term limits, I think, is their own can of worms. I'm not a fan of term limits, but I definitely think, Elizabeth Warren was a strong proponent of massive electoral reform. Pete Buttigieg wanted the Electoral College abolished. I actually think at least 7 or 8 of the original pool of Democratic nominees wanted to abolish the Electoral College, wanted to reform all, voting on all different levels, wanted to ban partisan gerrymandering. So I actually think, at least among Democrats, there was a lot of ferment for reform even before COVID hit the scene. Republicans, not so much. I'm hoping that, right now, Republicans think that if they hold the line, if they keep voters, home, if fewer people vote, they say this openly. This is not me characterizing them. This is what they say, is when fewer people vote, they win. They're more likely to win. And so that's not a very conducive attitude toward reform, right? But, when Republicans start losing, which they're going to, I think then that opens up the opportunities and the desire, the appetite for reform on that side as well. And then I think you really see more possibilities when both sides are together realizing that, wow, this system doesn't work for us. But yeah, we're not there right now, and it's going to take a few more years at least before I think we get there.
And I'm talking more about a Teddy Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party, that was literally the number one issue was reform up and down the system. And we really haven't had leadership to push reform of the political system. And that's different. I agree with Warren and Mayor Pete. And I'm not saying that they didn't advocate that, but it wasn't the key issue. It hasn't been the key issue.
No, it definitely deserves a lot more attention. I mean, one of the things that was fun in writing this book is I know that electoral reform issues and voting issues don't tend to excite people that much. And this issue, the Electoral College, for me, it was really amazing just how much people do care about it. It really is like a visceral thing for people, like how they choose their leader and the feeling that they are ignored or erased in the choice of their leader. That is something that doesn't sit well with anybody. And I had a lot of people raise their voices at me when I was talking to them about it. And it made me realize this is something people care about. And when people care, it's a key, crucial ingredient to reform. So people care. I hope people read this book because I think it actually is a fairly easy to read story of the history of the college and of the ways in which it actually functions, which I think a lot of people don't understand, and the ways in which we could change it. And I hope that begins a discussion that filters up to the state houses and to state lawmakers, who are the ones who would have to either ratify a constitutional amendment or adopt this interstate compact. I think the possibility is there, and I just think we need to get there. We're not that far.
Okay. Thank you, Jesse.
Thanks so much for having me.
John, do you want to say anything as we close?
I do. Well, first of all, I would like to thank both of you, Jesse Wegman and Professor Caroline Tolbert from the University of Iowa, for today's discussion. It was wonderful. And I thought that it was just a great way to illuminate what is a very interesting book. And so we definitely appreciate that. I wanted to mention that we usually would have Prairie Lights on hand to sell books at our event. But for this virtual event, we have virtual book sales. So Prairie Lights has Jesse's book available for purchase, and they have free delivery in Iowa City and Coralville, as well as mail order. Hopefully the link, prairielightsbooks.com, is on your screen right now, as well as their phone number, 319-337-2681. I would definitely recommend folks get this book. I read it around the time of the Iowa caucuses, which was a very interesting time to be reading about electoral reform, and found it fascinating. So again, thanks to Jesse for that. I also wanted to mention that a digital edition of the book, as well as the audio book, are available from the Iowa City Public Library, our co-sponsors tonight. You can get that through icpl.overdrive.com with a library card. So I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Again, this was our maiden voyage for doing virtual programming like this. Please tell us what you thought and let us know if you would like more programming like this in the future. Thanks again to Jesse and Caroline, and hope everyone has a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.